Hello everybody, and welcome to a slightly different type of video that I'm going to be doing. In this video I've taken my previous 3 Too Big to Walk videos breaking down that book, and I'm going to compile them into one big video with the introductions to each one removed and replaced with this little introduction at the start, as well as I'll probably do an outro at the end. And I will also be updating any information and clarifying any information that I got wrong in there. I think that's all for now, so let's just get right into the first one. Before we actually get into the book, it is worth noting that just like friend of the channel David Peters, Brian J. Ford is not a paleontologist nor an actual published qualified scientist. He's an independent worker in the field of microbiology and has made many discoveries and is pretty commended in that field, but he also does not know about paleontology. He also is a university dropout, hence is not actually fully being qualified as a scientist, and this has given him a hate for the institution of science. I don't have any intro to this segment, so I'll just get straight into it. He claims that dinosaurs were the biggest animals ever, clearly forgetting about the existence of whales. He also claims that it was physically and biologically impossible for dinosaurs to hold their tails up. In fact, we have trackways from dinosaurs which show, with the occasional exception, that their trails did not drag. Not only this, but the bones in the tail were reinforced in this position, meaning it would take much more effort and potentially break them for them to drag the tails rather than to hold them up. He also claims that most speculation about dinosaur behavior is based on no evidence and just made up by scientists. As well as this, he has a major case of Galileo syndrome, which is what I call it when someone claims that their pet theory is suppressed by the scientific establishment, because scientists don't like new ideas, because these new ideas won't get published and funded. Or so they claim. Ford claims that scientists are talking about imaginary planets, whatever that means, and talks about the hero worship of Darwin, something that doesn't really exist and is borderline creationist propaganda, but I'll get to that in much more detail later. He also claims that the idea that birds are dinosaurs is absurd, and that dinosaurs were not wiped out by a meteorite, and that if this was true, then all other reptiles would have been wiped out. All these and more will be covered in more depth and debunked properly later on in this video and this series. Early on in this chapter, Ford goes on a 3-page tangent about the importance of dragons in Chinese culture and mythology, which is very interesting, I know, but is not exactly relevant to the point of this book, as the entire first few chapters are not relevant at all, as he just talks about the history of geology and paleontology. In this chapter, Ford also talks about the jasper seal from Uruk, Mesopotamia, which depicts serpopods, which he claims look like sauropods. Maybe they do if you don't have a functioning brain. Speaking of non-functioning brains, this artifact is often used by young Earth creationists as evidence that humans lived alongside dinosaurs, and Ford is just playing into that idea with this. He also claims that they may have been based on sauropod fossils, when we know what they are. They're literally just fucking big cats with long necks. He also says that we know that the ancients knew of fossils, and then as evidence cites one of these so-called ancients, Ibn Sina, or Avicenna, who lived from approximately 980 to 1037 CE, which A, is not fucking ancient, and B, is approximately 4,000 years after the cylinder seals were made. Ford also claims that the so-called Angkor Wat stegosaur could be based on a fossil, when he himself points out that it shares almost nothing in common with the stegosaur other than the plates and having a vertebrate body plan. He claims that Stegosaurus, not the clade stegosaurs, but the genus Stegosaurus, is known from Laos and Vietnam. is only known from the United States and Portugal. He then spends the next almost 10 pages talking about various cultures around the world who have artifacts or beliefs that are supposedly based on fossils, but there's not really any evidence of this, and most of these are much more obscure than the ones I've already mentioned, and as such I wasn't able to look into and debunk each one individually. He uses an offensive and outdated term for Australian Indigenous people, and also conflates a traditional term used by a single Aboriginal group as being used by all Aboriginal peoples, of which there are more than 500 language groups or tribes. Ford claims that Bennetai tails are close relatives of modern cycads, when they aren't. They belong to a completely different phylum, or as botanists call them, division, and only look similar through convergent evolution. He also calls Mosasaurus hoffmanii a dinosaur. Ford mistakenly claims the word ornithology comes from the Greek for formed, when instead comes from the Greek word for dug up. He also states that cycads were around in the Carboniferous when they did not evolve until the Permian. Almost every single time he gives the size estimate for a dinosaur, he exaggerates it, claiming, for example, iguanodon grew to 13 meters long when they are known to have grown to 11 meters at the very, very maximum. Along the same theme, he claims Hylaeosaurus was 9 meters long, when most estimates place it at about 5 to 7 meters long. Ford calls phytosaurs dinosaurs. He also spells the name of the indeterminate archosaur Paleosaurus, which he mistakenly labels as a phytosaur, as Paleosaurus, which is not an indeterminate archosaur, but in fact a kaiju appearing in the 1959 movie The Giant Behemoth. He also refers to Thecodontosaurus, which was a basal sauropodomorph, as a true sauropod. Clearly Brian J. Ford has never seen a swan before, because he claims that Compsognathus was around the same size as one, when if you look at them, it's much smaller. Ford states, in reference to Compsognathus, that at the time nobody realized that this was a raptor, in essence one of the tribe to which P. Kilopleuron and Megalosaurus belonged. This makes absolutely no sense, as none of the referenced dinosaurs, Compsognathus, P. Kilopleuron, or Megalosaurus, are raptors in any way, shape, or form. Spends about 14 pages writing about how Darwin did not actually invent the idea of evolution by natural selection, and complaining about supposed hero worship of Darwin by scientists. No person who knows about the topic will claim that Darwin completely came up with the idea. The ideas existed for a long time before Darwin. He just synthesized various ideas together, added his own ideas into the mix, and brought it to public attention. He also claims that the idea of survival of the fittest does not appear in On the Origin of Species. Although Darwin does not use the term survival of the fittest, the idea is definitely in there, being one of the main theses of the text. He acts like he is revealing information that has been kept hidden when he mentions that Darwin believed in Lamarckian evolution, when once again anyone knowledgeable on the subject would be aware that Darwin did believe in Lamarckian evolution, at least for a time. He also claims that epigenetics has partially proved Lamarck right, when this is completely wrong. Epigenetics can regulate minor genetic changes based on the environment while a fetus is developing, which is barely anything like Lamarckian evolution. Ford claims that any scientist who is not a Darwinist, note that his definition of Darwinism, the hero worship of Darwin, is different to the most commonly used definition, which is an attempt by creationists to make evolution look like a religion. He claims that any scientist who is not a Darwinist is instantly treated with scorn or rejection, comparing it to the House Un-American Activities Committee trials under McCarthyism. He also claims that evolution by natural selection was already commonly accepted by scientists in Darwin's day. Now, I'm not an expert on this, but I assume that On the Origin of Species wouldn't have been so revolutionary if the concept was already commonly accepted. And he claims that Archaeopteryx was identified as a theropod after the fact in order to gain attention. For some reason, the second video in this series, which we're about to go into, has a different aspect ratio to the other two, and as such, it will look weird. Ford continues with calling non-dinosaurian extinct animals dinosaurs, this time Elasmosaurus, a plesiosaur. He also calls Omosaurus a crocodile, when it was in reality an indeterminate Crurotarsan, possibly a phytosaur, and claims Iguanodon mantelli was synonymized with Mantellosaurus athaphylodensis, when it was actually synonymized with Iguanodon anglicus, and claims that Stegosaurus had 8 thagomizers, when anyone that knows anything about dinosaurs knows that it had 4. Ford argues that there is some merit to the Torosaurus being an adult Triceratops hypothesis. There isn't if you wanted to disprove it. Really simply, just take this little fact. There are 2 different Triceratops species, one of which evolved into the other. This is not true of Torosaurus. We also have juvenile Torosaurus skulls, and they do not look that similar to Triceratops. He also says that birds are distantly derived from Saurischians, whatever the fuck that means. He says that Brontosaurus was originally given a Brachiosaurus skull, when it was a Camarasaurus skull that was mistakenly used, and claims that Tyrannosaurus is known from Asia. He is confusing it with Tarbosaurus, which has not been credibly assigned as a synonym of Tyrannosaurus since the 90s. He claims that scientists identified the Tyrannosaurus rex specimen known as Sue as female, but this is not true. It would be impossible to tell, as T-Rex does not display sexual dimorphism. Ford also overestimates the size of Hypsilosaurus as 15, rather than a more realistic 12 meters long, and claims that Tarbosaurus never existed in a genus, that it was proposed in 1955 but rejected, and that T. batar is a species of Tyrannosaurus. Now this is obviously absurd. Tarbosaurus has been valid since 1955 when it was named, although it was in the 90s sometimes placed within Tyrannosaurus. It is definitively not placed within Tyrannosaurus anymore, except by cranks like Gregory S. Paul. Ford mistakenly calls Sophie the Stegosaurus Sophia the Stegosaurus. He also misidentifies the Borealopelta mummy as a Nodosaurus. It is a nodosaur, but not belonging to the genus Nodosaurus, and misspells Gojira, which is, if you don't know, the original Japanese name for Godzilla, as Gijora. And I'm just going to say this now, Brian, but fire your editor. You're clearly paying him to do absolutely nothing, because there is not the most basic fact-checking or even spell-checking in here. He also says that Antarctopelta was an Ankylosaurus. It was not. They're completely different genera. And claims scientists use complicated jargon intentionally just to keep out and confuse the general public. This is not why they use complicated terms. They use complicated terms so that they can express what they mean with as much precision as is possible. And says that the dinosaur renaissance occurred solely to drum up more public interest in paleontology, which is just fucking stupid. He claims most people know nothing about the Paleogene, as opposed to the tertiary period, of course, which everybody knows so much about. He then says that dinosaur weight estimates were reduced in the 80s based on nothing in order to support the new, more active view of dinosaurs, and claims no reptile has ever evolved a method of maintaining a warm inner body temperature. Which, what about birds? Even Ford accepts that they're reptiles, even though I have no fucking clue if he accepts them as dinosaurs, as he seems to change his position on it every chapter. And last time I checked, birds were warm-blooded. He also claims that evidence from sauropods debunks the idea that dinosaurs were carrying pendants. Has he considered that dinosaurs were a very, very large and diverse clade with various parenting strategy? That would be like saying that the existence of megapods debunks the idea that birds could be nest parasites. He then spends several pages claiming that we can't know how big titanosaurs actually were or what they truly looked like, as they are often only known from fragmentary remains, but we can use their more complete relatives to make estimate guesses as to the sizes and proportions of creatures. It's not like they're completely novel and we have nothing to compare them to. He then says that Giganotosaurus was far bigger than T-Rex. This is completely untrue. Size estimates are primarily based on mass, and T-Rex is much heavier, as well as potentially reaching a similar maximum length to that of Giganotosaurus anyway. Ford states that Norfolk Island is located between Australia and New Zealand, when if you look at a map you can see that is clearly not true. He calls Meganeura a dragonfly. It wasn't. It belonged to Meganisoptera, or griffin flies, a much more basal group of insects within the same lineage. Calls the red kangaroo Macropus rufus, when it has been for quite a while classified as a member of the genus Ospharanta, and claims kangaroos can run. They can't due to their oversized feet, they can only hop, and says that the bones in sauropods' necks would make it impossible for them to hold their heads up. This is incorrect. In fact, the spines of macronarian sauropods are oriented specifically so that they would have to have held their heads up in a diagonal direction. Ford states that it must have also been because of their evolution in water that the originally four-legged tyrannosaurs lost use of their forelimbs. I have no clue what he's talking about here, as the most recent quadrupedal ancestors of tyrannosaurs would have been basal archosaurs living in the early Triassic, millions of years before any dinosaurs at all evolved. This is the point where he begins to properly get into his hypothesis, so this is why I'll begin to really tear into him. For one, he talks about how evolving in water is the only logical explanation for adaptations such as tyrannosaurs' tiny arms and sauropods' massive sizes. If this is true, then why didn't they evolve other useful traits, such as fin-like limbs or paddle-like tails? He uses the term prosauropod, which is no longer an actual clade due to not referring to a valid grouping, and hasn't been used for quite a while. He claims that there is no evidence for sauropods producing numerous small offspring, despite the fact that he mentioned in the previous chapter that there was evidence of sauropod nests, which there obviously is, and that this proved that dinosaurs weren't nurturing parents. He claims that dinosaurs would have had to struggle onto land to lay eggs. Why, in their 150 plus million years of existence, would they have not evolved the simple strategy of live birth, which we know is possible in reptiles, as it is seen in multiple marine reptiles from the age of the dinosaurs, as well as in many modern snakes. He calls Paraceratherium the largest land mammal ever, despite mentioning Paleoloxodon on the same page. Claims hadrosaurs evolved to eat waterweed. For one, waterweed alone would not be able to sustain the many species of hadrosaur, each being large and numerous herbivores. Secondly, hadrosaurs were actually more well adapted to eat more hardy vegetation, something much more common than waterweed, but not common in the water. Another gaping hole in this theory is that if practically all dinosaurs except the small ones filled the same two niches, large mostly aquatic coastal herbivores and large mostly aquatic coastal carnivores as he claims, then why do we have thousands of known species as well as likely millions of unknown ones? A good comparison is crocodiles. Modern crocodilians fill practically the same niche as Ford's conception of theropods, yet there are only 28 species of modern crocodilian compared to hundreds if not thousands of species of theropod on Earth at one given time. There is no good comparison to Ford's conception of herbivorous dinosaurs, as it would be practically impossible for one species of sauropod, let alone hundreds, and especially with Ford's inflated waste estimates, to sustain themselves exclusively on plants found in and around the margins of water bodies. Ford goes on to claim that there are approximately 160,000 species of dinosaurs existing throughout the entirety of the Mesozoic. For comparison, there are more than 11,000 dinosaurs alive right now during the brief period that is now, rather than the 150 plus million years that is the entire length of the Mesozoic. And he also continues to spread the outdated idea that dinosaur diversity was decreasing before the KPG extinction, and uses this as evidence that the dinosaurs weren't wiped out by the Chicxulub meteorite. Ford talks about his hypothesis of baryonyx hunting fish in water. Interestingly, a study into dinosaur bone density from 2022 by Fabry et al. Has shown that this may be accurate, as its results indicate that baryonyx had denser bones, meaning it would have been adapted for hunting fish while submerged in water. Unfortunately for Ford, these dense bones are unusual among dinosaurs, meaning that they weren't adapted for living in water, other than possibly Baryonyx and Spinosaurus. I don't think Ford understands how water works, because he believes that most if not all dinosaur footprints are from mud at the bottom of water bodies. This is stupid for two reasons. One, footprints will last much less time in order to be preserved if they form at the bottom of a water body, and two, the footprints of an animal will look significantly different if it is swimming rather than walking. He claims that all dinosaur footprints are the same depth. This is untrue. An extreme example are ichnofossils from China, which are the footprints of sauropods that are deep enough to contain the corpses of several other smaller dinosaurs. It would be impossible for a sauropod to make these prints while swimming. It would have to be walking on solid ground for its feet to be go deep enough to fill these pits. And it is also likely that most dinosaur footprints would be of a similar depth if this was true, which we, for the sake of argument, say it is, because they would be filled in by mud slightly after creation. He also argues that the sacral vertebrae would fuse in sauropods to act as a counterbalance for them to walk on their hind limbs, and claims this supports his argument, but surely if they spent most of their time supported by water, they wouldn't need a counterbalance. He also claims that almost all sauropod footprints preserve only a single set of feet, something that, from the evidence I find, appears to me complete and utter bullshit. I'm also highly doubtful of his hypothesis of how sauropods would have fed. He thinks they were fed by reaching down into water to eat plants, but this would put increased pressure on the head, and if done for a prolonged amount of time, which they would have to do for them to get anywhere near enough food, could lead to major ear and sinus issues, as well as the dinosaur being in a constant state of pain and discomfort while eating. In fact, you can experience this same effect by going to the local pool and putting yourself in some position where your head is below the rest of your body. Now imagine doing that practically all day, every day, only taking breaks to come out and breathe. He also claims that sauropods would have had to have held their necks flat, laying them on the water. Unfortunately for this theory, this was impossible for Macronarans, a clade of sauropods which contains the largest of all dinosaurs, as the skeletal structure of their body forces them to have a much more vertical neck position. For their neck to rest on the water's surface, they would have to be positioned with the back half of their body sticking out of the water. He talks about his tail theory again. I've already debunked this in part 1 of the series, but I'll do it again brief here. Their tails had bones to reinforce them in their current position, meaning it would take more effort and potentially even require them to break their own tails to drag their tails, which he thinks they could. He calls Iguanodon a biped when it was in reality mostly quadrupedal. Ford argues that Spinosaurus's high-placed nostrils, which were in reality an adaptation to aquatic life, he argues that these are evidence of dinosaurs being aquatic, but forgets one incredibly vital detail. These high-placed nostrils are only significant in Spinosaurus because this is not a trait seen in other dinosaurs. Therefore, this is actually evidence against his theory. And then, he claims that scientists are opposed to private ownership of fossils because they want the glory of being able to describe them. In this chapter, Ford complains about Spinosaurus being shown as hunting like a heron in Planet Dinosaur. Ironically enough, actual science, more recently, has shown that this is the most likely method by which Spinosaurus hunted, rather than being partially or fully submerged in water. He constantly brings up Spinosaurus' adaptation as evidence of his theory, but if all dinosaurs were aquatic, why wouldn't they all have adaptations to living in water like Spinosaurus? And Spinosaurus would not actually be that unique. Ford also claims that it is absurd to call birds dinosaurs and that they only share a common ancestor, comparing this to calling humans lemurs. There is a major problem here. Humans share a common ancestor with lemurs, while birds are directly descended from dinosaurs. Saying birds aren't dinosaurs is like saying humans aren't apes. He also claims that all dinosaur fossils are known from rocks that are originally mud. Although most are known from such rocks, there are some known from rocks that were originally desert sands. And even if it were true, it wouldn't be evidence of his theory, as the reason for this is due to preservation bias. Muds and similar substances are the best at preserving organic matter from decay and allowing them to fossilize. He also claims that crocodiles are not adapted to an aquatic lifestyle, and since dinosaurs aren't either, this apparently is evidence for his theory. Unfortunately for him, he's fucking stupid. Crocodiles are adapted for life in water. They have webbed digits and a tall spined tail to propel them through water. He claims that bite marks on the skulls of dinosaurs were actually caused by disease, not puncture marks due to biting. In this chapter, Ford conflates sex and gender, and if you don't know the difference, sex is the physical characteristics you have at birth, while gender is how you feel. He then claims it would be significantly more feasible for dinosaurs to mate in water, when really it wouldn't. We are now in the lab, aka my backyard. I have a tub of water and a pair of Triceratops, and I'm going to demonstrate the implausibility of Ford's idea that water would have made it easier to mate, for Triceratops to mate. If they, for example, the male would get on top of the female, then these are very heavy creatures, and he would simply push her down and drown her. If, on the other hand, they somehow got into a precarious position, they would have to float on their sides, which is not a particularly plausible position for them to be in. As you can see, again, not very plausible. Back to the studio. Over the next few pages, he begins talking about his theories on the ecosystems and climate during the Mesozoic. Now, I know next to nothing about paleoecology and paleoclimatology, and I am not going to learn about them just so I can debunk his stupid book, so therefore my bunking in this chapter will be a little less extensive. He also claims Microraptor was exclusively piscivorous. Although there is evidence it fed on fish, and it appears to have been partially adapted to this, its diet was not completely made up of fish. Unfortunately for him, we have evidence of a lizard within the stomach of a Microraptor fossil. Also, there is no evidence in Microraptor's feathers of an adaptation to aquatic lifestyle, something that should be expected. Microraptor also has wing joints adapted for flight, but it could be argued that these were an adaptation for swimming through water similar to a penguin. He also acts like a 1975 study by Walter Coombs, which analysed a dinosaur trackway, finding it to be made by a swimming theropod, supports his idea, when it does the opposite, like with Spinosaurus. The only reason these tracks are significant is they're being made by a theropod which was swimming. Throughout this chapter, Ford keeps calling Ernst Stromer, who was the German paleontologist who discovered Spinosaurus, among other Egyptian dinosaurs, Ernst Römer, possibly confusing him with Alfred Römer, an American paleontologist whose speciality was the taxonomy of Paleozoic tetrapods, not related to Spinosaurus at all. He also claims that the shorter legs assigned to Spinosaurus were actually misidentified and belonged to something else, because they look wrong to him and don't conform to his own hypothesis. Newsflash Ford, nature doesn't care about what you or your stupid bullshit hypotheses think look right, and I'm fairly sure that paleontologists who actually studied the fossil know it better than you, who have only looked at it through pictures. Ford once again talks about paleoclimatology for ages, something I, once again, know nothing about, and I'm not going to waste my life researching it, so I'm not talking about it, and if you have a problem with that, not my problem. He claims Robert Bakker was the scientific advisor on Jurassic Park, when that was in fact Jack Horner. Ford calls crocodiles the nearest living descendants of dinosaurs. This is not only a meaningless statement, as you can't be closer or further from your descendant except by the number of generations, and given we are only talking about extant animals, there's approximately the same amount of generations between all creatures then and all creatures now. For another thing, crocodiles are not descended from dinosaurs. Instead, they belong to an entirely separate branch of Archosauria, and they are not even the closest living relatives of dinosaurs, as living dinosaurs, aka birds, exist. In this chapter, Ford calls the tuatara a lizard. It is not, in fact, being the only living member of Rhynchocephalia, an ancient clade of more basal lepidopterosaurs. He also claims it dates back 200 million years. This is a very ambiguous statement, so I cannot properly assess the truthfulness of it. The tuatara itself, Sphenodon punctatus, only evolved 19 million years ago, but Rhynchocephalians evolved in the mid-Triassic approximately 240 million years ago, so it's likely that this is what he was referring to, but he could have been much more clear. Ford brings up the Wollemi pine, and as such I am legally obligated to mention that my mum knew David Noble, the guy who discovered the living populations of the Wollemi pine. Ford claims that Ginkgo biloba, specific to the species Ginkgo biloba, but not the genus Ginkgo, dates back 270 million years to the Permian. Ginkgo biloba only dates back 51 million years to the Eocene. Ginkgo, the genus, dates back to the mid-Jurassic, approximately 170 million years ago, while the family Ginkgoaceae dates back to the Permian. He calls the tuatara the closest living relative to the dinosaurs. This is absolutely insane. Tuataras and lepidopterosaurs are a completely different group of reptiles to the Archosaurian dinosaurs. Even if we ignore birds, the living descendants of dinosaurs, and crocodiles, which though more distantly related to dinosaurs are still archosaurs, turtles are closer to dinosaurs than lepidopterosaurs, belonging to the sister clade Archosauria. He compares calling birds dinosaurs to calling lizards frogs or humans marmosets. I explained why this is wrong earlier in the video, but I want to show you that he makes these stupid claims repeatedly. He calls solenodons selenodons, and claims crocodiles do not have webbed feet. They do. The webbing is just less prominent in them than in many other creatures. He spent several pages discussing increasingly preposterous hypotheses for the extinction of the dinosaurs, and he of course doesn't believe in the widely held meteorite theory. Ford's final declaration on the matter of the KPG extinction is that it was caused by the breakup of Pangaea, causing a decrease in sea level, destroying the environments he believed dinosaurs required to survive. There is one slight, teeny tiny problem with this. Pangaea broke up in the early Jurassic, more than 130 million years before the end Cretaceous extinction. And now, Ford, being the complete and utter moron that he is, makes a claim that will cause any person even slightly knowledgeable about paleontology to simultaneously have a heart attack, an aneurysm, and a stroke. Whilst talking about the KPG extinction, he says, "Not all dinosaurs disappeared. One of the first dinosaurs to be discovered, Lystrosaurus, lived on." There are so many things wrong with this. One, it is not claimed that all dinosaurs instantly died in the extinction event. Even disregarding birds which survive to this day, some non-avian dinosaurs clung to life for months, possibly even years, before finally going extinct. Two, Lystrosaurus was not a dinosaur. It was not even a reptile. It was a Dicynodont synapsid related to the ancestors of mammals. And finally, it didn't survive the KPG extinction event, given that by then it had already been extinct for 180 million years. Instead, Lystrosaurus survived the previous, much more devastating Permian Triassic extinction, commonly known as the Great Dying. Ford should probably kill his editor for missing a fuck-up of this magnitude. The final entry in this video is that he somehow misinterprets a piece of paleart showing a Brontosaurus and a Utahraptor as being a species known as Brontosaurus Utahraptor. And that was Too Big to Walk again. I hope you enjoyed that, because it was a massive pain to watch through all of those again and edit them. I'm just glad they weren't all super long, and I'll see you next time when I will do another video. Goodbye.